Good afternoon, everybody. I call this my mess because I didn't start it out doing anything about Lafayette except for one salient fact. I've been traipsing along in his pathway since I was a kid because, as mentioned, I lived in New Jersey, Revolutionary War territory, every other block. And there was a Lafayette encampment 5 miles from my home. I used to read the monument every time my dad took me and my sister to the Dairy Queen because it was right there at the Dairy Queen. They had the monument, the marker. So I got to know this guy over and over again. And as I grew up and went different places, I would end up having to run into Gilbert, his real name, over and over again, including after I was living in Germany. And I came to Alabama. Don't ask why. It was a strange tale. And I was sitting in another historian's office. He was an archivist in a library. And we were just shooting the bull. And I told him just before I moved here, I had gone to Paris and visited Lafayette's grave in Picpus Cemetery. And he turns to me and said, "Larry, did you know that Lafayette passed 5 miles from your house?" There's that number again. "And he came here on the Federal Road." And I'm going in my head, this was not Revolutionary War territory. What the heck was he doing here? And what's a Federal Road? I had no idea about any of this. So he hands me this big, thick, hard-covered, green, musty book, fiddles it up. Read this 4-page chapter in a book about Lafayette's tour of Alabama. Oh, cool. Is there anything else about this that we know about? Well, not much. How many places did he go? A few. How long was he here? A few days. Really informative. And I thought, well, I was looking for a project anyway. Maybe this will be a good book to write, sort of a AAA guide to Lafayette's places. How hard can that be? A year and a half later, I came out with 9 days traveling in December of 2019. An absolutely excellent time for a historical travel book. So, meanwhile, I had found that everything in that book that he showed me was wrong, or most of it. It had him going to Demopolis. No, he didn't. Had him staying 5 days in Montgomery, Alabama. No, 2. And on and on and on. There were all sorts of mistakes. So, I decided I needed to write a better book. So, you all know about Lafayette. I'm not going to talk about his biography and anything, with the one exception that apparently on the French side of my family, I have ancestors who came from that area, which might explain my French ability. Okay. Why was he here in the USA? He was here because James Monroe wanted to have somebody who could unite the eternally fractious states of the United States. Sound familiar? And celebrating the 50th anniversary of the start of the Revolutionary War. So he invited him. He hadn't been here for almost 50 years. Invited him up here. And oddly enough, for the second time in his life, the French government did not want him to leave. They stopped him. So he had to do a circuitous way out of France in order to come here, all expenses paid, to visit the States and give talks and make everybody happy. Okay. So he came here in 1824, landed in New York City this time. When he first came here, he didn't speak English. And he landed in South Carolina. He learned faster than about anybody I could think of. Within months, he was all but fluent. But in 1824, he landed in New York, and most of 1824, he spent the time visiting New England states, mid-Atlantic states, and got as far south as Yorktown. And that was it. And that was all he expected. All he did was he'd go everywhere, they'd give speeches, he'd give a speech, and so on. And then they'd have food and drink like you would not believe. I do not want to have to pay that kind of bill if we invite him back. And I don't know how these guys could drink that much, because at minimum there were 13 toasts for every dinner. Minimum 13. In one place I counted something like 47 toasts. Alcoholics Anonymous, where are you? Why was he here in Alabama for me to be able to write a book and this other guy write one? The reason is our governor, we were a new state. We were only 6 years old, barely into first grade. And our governors, along with hundreds of other people, wrote letters inviting Lafayette. If he had accepted every one of them, he'd still be here. But he wrote one that got his attention. He said to Lafayette, "Come here. We are one of the new Americas. We're a new state. We're not like the, quote, elder sisters, which the original 13 were called back then. We're not like that. Come and see what the United States is going to look like." And this intrigued him, because Lafayette had never been west of the Appalachian Mountains. Not once, not during the war, not before, not after. He had never been here, and he would get to see people and peoples that he would never have an opportunity to do. So he agreed to that, much to the dismay of the governor of Georgia. Governor Troup also invited him, and Lafayette didn't want to do it. We had an advantage. We convinced him, but Troup didn't want him to do it because Lafayette only wanted to go to places he had a personal experience with. And he had never been to Georgia, hadn't been here either. But the idea of coming to see these new things and Indians and go to New Orleans, the French, formerly French city, that got him. So after wintering over in the Washington, D.C. area and a little bit of travel throughout the winter months, in February, he heads south, does a few things around Yorktown and Richmond and so on, goes into North Carolina, visits places, comes down, visits several places, South Carolina and into Georgia, and he crosses over the Chattahoochee River into Alabama on March 31st, 1825, a 200th anniversary that is coming up very quickly. Briefly, Lafayette made a dash through eastern Alabama, which was at that time mostly Creek Indian territory, and then went down the Alabama River in a brand new high-speed thing, the internet of the day, the steamboat. And he ends up down here in Mobile and takes an unscheduled trip at his request to go to Mobile Point, or to see Fort Bowyer, or what was left of it, being rebuilt into Fort Morgan. Cool. He didn't want to do that. He knew that the guy building it was a colleague of his who he had communicated with, knew all about. They knew each other, never met. And you don't tell the nation's guest no. So that was an unscheduled stop. And interestingly, only one person wrote about it, and that was Governor Pickens, who wrote letters back. That's the only way we know about it. His manservant that was with him didn't write about it. He wrote that big famous diary, Levasseur's Diary, became a story of the United States trip. He didn't say a word. Only the people that went there knew about it. So, what I want to do is take you on a sightseeing trip through nearly 300 miles of traveling in approximately 35 minutes. So buckle up. In the beginning, he crossed over from Georgia, the fourth state, into Creek territory at what was known as the Old Indian Agency on the Flint River. It took him 2 days to get to the Chattahoochee River. And he crossed over and spent another 3 days traveling through the Creek Indian until he got to Montgomery. So let's take a quick look at where he was on the day that he entered Alabama. Now, he started out in Georgia in a site called Calvary's Stand, also known as Moss's Stand. These stands were kind of the low-level hotels that the Creek Indians allowed, because you were not allowed off the Federal Road. Remember that, Federal Road? This whole thing goes through the Creek Nation. Creek Nation Treaty said you can build along the route that we pass a stand roughly every 16 miles, 1 day's travel, if you have good legs or horses. And that's time, and it can only be run by a white person in cahoots or married to a Creek Indian. And you could not put it off the Federal Road. They did not want white people in there. So Calvary's Stand happened the day after a tremendous storm. I suspect it was a severe thunderstorm, a spring storm, and they all scattered into the winds, different places, and arrived at Calvary's Stand late in the day. And I actually found a map showing its location from 1827, only 2 years later. And nearby was a place called Hambly's Farm, because they met Hambly, an English-speaking Creek Indian, after they got there, and he invited them to see what Creek life was like. Lafayette demurred. He wanted to stay put after all this horrible day. But Levasseur and some of the aides of the governor went down there to see it. Now, I have to interject. My way of writing is part of an idea that I've had since I was a kid. History in school is boring. Names, dates, places, test. But history is not boring if you concentrate on the two last syllables of that word: the story, the context, the why, the how, and so on. And it's best done if you can hear the story or see the story by being at the place it happened. Levasseur mentions a lot of places. Levasseur's diary is very interesting reading. And you get a lot of insights from Levasseur about Indians and such. But he's not very good at recording the sites. Where were they? Well, it was over here. Where's Calvary's Stand? Georgia. Doesn't tell you where. Took a lot of detective work to find out where the heck did these places happen. He's really good at recording all the speeches and how many toasts there were, but not where. He's good at addresses, but not addresses. So I had to find maps, and I found those two places, and it's on what is today Fort Moore, formerly Fort Benning. It's on their reservation, and I got permission to go into it because it's not open to the public without a real reason, and you can't go everywhere. So they escorted me around, and I wanted to stand where Calvary's Stand was. It's over here in that brown zone. Why couldn't I get any closer? Because that's where they practice their artillery and tanks. And there's unexploded ordnance. You can only go there if you've got a death wish. And I didn't want to make my ex-wife any happier. So it's over here about a third of a mile away, but we were up on a ridge and I could take a picture. Yay, okay. I even went to Hambly's Farm. That I could get to. Hambly's Farm, of course, no longer exists after 200 years, but I could stand there. And I did that a year ago on Halloween. Talk about a spooky feeling to be standing in what used to be a 4-cabin creek homestead with all the creeks that he had built around him, or had been built by nature around him. And you're looking and you could just imagine those houses there and just sort of feel the ghosts. It was weird. So Calvary's Stand is where they spent the night. And the next morning, they headed towards the Chattahoochee River on the Federal Road. And they meet at a place that's today known as Cardiac Hill. because all the guys there who have to do running, you know, all over the base for their exercise and whatever, it's the steepest hill on the reservation. And the reason I know where it is, Levasseur says it was about a mile. About a mile puts it right by a set of springs that are still active today. You can go there and watch the water come out of the hill. You don't usually get to find that. And right down here at the bottom of Cardiac Hill is where they met. At least that's where I presume it to be. So this is Cardiac Hill, which I definitely would have if I tried. And there's the spring, or one of them. And you can see it, if you look closer, it may be hard for you in the seats, but there's a radiating pattern of water coming out live at that point. So he meets the Alabama delegation and the Creek Indians, including a man named Shilly McIntosh, who was the son of a chief and had been educated up north, came back here and met Lafayette and helped to escort him across the river. This is the view looking from Georgia to where he lands in Alabama. It's one of the few places you can actually go that's still original. You can go there, stand where Lafayette got off the boat. Well, not quite. They ferried him over with his cabriolet, which is a four-wheeled vehicle with a kind of a roof. We still use that word when we talk about certain kinds of convertible cars. But when he got to that little mud flat, the Creek Indians wouldn't let him out. He had to stay in the cabriolet. And they picked it up as a group. There's like about 100 of them or 50 of them. Picked it up and they walked him out of the mud flat over here on a small hillside. Here's the Alabama side. You can stand where Lafayette was. This has been used ever since by the Army base as a place to test how people can cross the river with their tanks. That's why it still is here. And he gets up and they walk him up the hill from the riverside to a level zone where the politicos and the Alabama militia meet him and take over from the Creek Indians. They would not let this man who was so famous and so important walk in the mud. This is one of the rare times that the Creek Indians and the Alabama people actually got along. They were eternally at odds. There had been a war in 1813. There was one coming up they didn't know about, but people kind of suspected. But here they all respected him and they all got along. Ends up at Fort Mitchell, which still exists as a park. This is a recreation of Fort Mitchell from 1813. Not 1824 and 5. When Lafayette got there, this original fort had been torn down and it had been turned back over to the Creek Nation. And they had small factories and trading posts and other things there, but the fort had been taken down. Now, when Lafayette got there, I am uncertain whether they had started to rebuild the second fort or build the second fort. I can't find definitive records of this. Then probably we're starting it up again, but it had not been completed. So this is not original. The original that he saw is buried underground. So they took him up the hill, and then they took the federal road through what still exists today as woods on the Fort Moore, Alabama side, and you can actually sneak in there. They don't have any guards on that point. You can sneak in and actually see fragments, and they're not easy to see, but you can find them. Fragments of the 200-year-old plus federal road, which was built in 1806 to connect the colonies, former colonies rather, to the states from Milledgeville, Georgia, down to Fort Stevens, St. Stevens now, just before you got to Spanish West Florida. And to get mail to New Orleans from that point, they had to get permission from the Spanish, which gave it, but grudgingly. Then we took over Spanish West Florida, and we didn't have to worry about it anymore. So Lafayette gets there, and this is a map of the territory of the park, if you will. And they meet next to the fort that has been recreated here. This is, they have all the speeches. And then there's a puzzle. The Indians went and played a game that was kind of like lacrosse in Lafayette's honor, except that it used an extremely hard ball. Everybody got hurt. There were 50 people on a side, and that you were all naked. Other than that, it's like lacrosse. The question is where? There is a part of the park way down here to the southwest called the ball ground that the Indians supposedly played. There is no known record of it being there. It's just apocryphal. And back then, it was much, much smaller than the park has done today. It's now been leveled out. It's a huge green space. But there's no record that he did it. And the quotes from the people, the chroniclers that were with him, Levasseur and General Thomas Woodward, all say they, after all the speeches, they immediately set off to do the game, right then and there. So I think it actually took place over here instead of here. And at a ball field that's near Crowell Cemetery, which was just barely started then, and Commander Crowell, who was in charge of Fort Mitchell, wasn't dead yet. But it's become known as, because he's buried there, as Crowell Cemetery. I think they met here, stayed on the Federal Road, which is the red line, had a lunch over here at a place where there was a tavern at one point. I know that it was there because it later became a stage depot. And I found that on a map. So we're quite sure that it was over here, nothing left today. And Crowell's house was on a straight line path in this direction, and parts of his home still exist in ruins inside the National Military Cemetery right next door. So if you want to see something here from Lafayette's visit, you're out of luck except for the Federal Road path, because there's fragments there. They're very poorly maintained. But right next door is Crowell's house. And you could see that from that time, even though Lafayette didn't go there. From there, they leave. You can see here that the Federal Road's been paved in the park. Right here is where the tavern was. And I'm trying to get permission, and they want to do this, to do GPR and metal detecting to try and figure out if we can find remnants of the tavern. After that, he goes 4 miles to Crabtree's Tavern. A guy named Crabtree, we don't know much about him. This tavern has always been known as Anthony's Tavern. At one point, one of the Crowells had it. At this time, it was Crabtree. So they crossed over on the natural bridge. There was an Indian campsite over here, so we know it had to be close because there's conversations with Indians recorded over at this creek. And this is where it is, and it's been plowed over. You cannot go walking on this. There's about 6 miles of federal road you cannot get to. It's all private property. The natural bridge was not a bridge. It was where the embankments on either side of the river disappeared briefly and was level to the level of the creek. So they could walk over it. There's only 2 places that happens. One's where the 2 creeks, Little and Big Ooshie, meet, and the other one is up a little higher. This thing likes to move ahead of me. So you see here, there's no embankment. Sorry about that. Computers have a mind of their own. Silicon. Anyway, so he walked over here, met what he thought was an Indian chief. The guy was just drunk. But right after Lafayette's visit, they built a real bridge just to the north of that, and you can still see pieces of the supports in the creek. Okay, now he gets there and he spends the night, and the next day he begins. This begins miles and miles of roughly following modern roads. Federal Road fragments are found all over the place in here if you know where to look. So that's why I made this map. You can find it followed this road, went right past a high school today, followed, there's a road going behind it. That was the Federal Road. And continues on, and there are a few places where you can actually see really good pieces. This is a pathway going into the woods on Route 22. And they continued on. At the end of the day, he stops at Warrior Stand over here because he wanted to meet Chief Big Warrior, who died 3 weeks ago before him. So you can see other fragments. Bournville Road is a good place to find fragments. You're allowed to see these fragments, provided you don't get out of the road right of way. Stay on the Bournville right of way, you can see it. You're not trespassing. Passes Fort Bainbridge, which was gone at that point, but right next door was Lewis's Tavern. Lewis's Tavern is right where these trees are, or I should say were, because this photograph was 2018, and when I went back to check last year, all the trees have been felled. But you can find the place where it was, because right next to it is a giant gouge in the ground, and they couldn't put a Federal Road stand there. So right here is where he was supposed to spend the night. But Lafayette's a typical man. Sun's still up, I'm driving. Some of you ladies are probably familiar with that attitude. He kept on going. So instead of staying there, Captain Lewis, who ran the tavern, went with him with a pack of more Creek Indians. And they went 7 miles down the road to see Big Warrior's house, which is right there, and you can see a tiny bit of archaeology here. He owned the whole mountaintop. That was his stand. That's where people could spend the night. And then the next day they moved on through the swamps. Now there's an interesting thing about the swamps here, both in Russell and in Macon County. Somewhere in there was a place where, because of those rains they had the day before they crossed the Chattahoochee, all the creeks were flooded. They couldn't figure out how to take his cabriolet and his horses and all those people through the swamps. Because the Federal Road was supposed to avoid swamps, but here it was, they couldn't do that. They couldn't find the road. But the Indians, the Creek Indians who lived there, knew where it was. So they went into the creek, flowing water and all, linked arms, and made a guide rail for them to cross the creeks. And that's one of 2 places in this whole state I can't find. Probably been eroded away. All right. At the end of about 5.5 miles of Forestry Company property, you come to the one and only place between Chattahoochee River and in Montgomery where you can walk the Federal Road, because it's the only place that's a public road. And that's in Davisville, which is south of Tuskegee. And when you go there, you can actually walk it, but be careful because the forestry company thinks it's their property, even though it's a public road, and they come barreling out with their loads of lumber and trees. And they don't expect to see walkers. I found that out the hard way. But you can walk the Federal Road here for about 1.5 miles before you hit their gate, and they won't let you in. The only place in this whole trip where I was forbidden to go. They wouldn't give me permission.
Which company was it?
I don't remember now. I probably have it in a note somewhere, but it's still, I'd like to see that route. I'd like to see that whole 5.5 miles between Warrior Stand and Davisville, bought by the state to be a linear park, and preserve that Federal Road. Now, I did get into it because they forgot to block one other road. So I kind of went in and explored a little bit. And then I was trying to get permission to do more. They said, how did you do that? I went, well, I just followed the road. I'd like to see them take that 5.5 miles and make that into a park. So if you've got pulled with any government politicos, I don't. But if you do, that would be a good purchase. Okay, so now we go through more swamps. On the third day, he passes by Walker's Tavern. He was supposed to stay there too at Polecat Springs. But there was that attitude. He was going to keep on driving. We got sunshine. So he ends up passing a place where the federal road has been honored. One place inside Macon County. There's a road called Old Federal Road. And it's close. Not quite there. It's parallel to the real one. So he gets there, ends up here at Lucas's Tavern in Waugh, and then Lucas's Tavern actually lasted in its site at its location until the 1970s or 80s, when it got picked up and moved to Montgomery's old Alabama town. And they fixed it up. This is not very appealing, but they fixed it up to look like its original form. This is one of two places Lafayette went to that you could actually still go to and see, except both of these two places are not on their original sites. I actually was able to get permission to go here. You can still find like an imprint in the ground, and you can see the federal road as a light gully with trees following the gully. And this is where he leaves the federal road to go to Montgomery. So he spent the night here. It was considered the best tavern, the best place to spend the night on the federal road. Because from here it heads southwest. And this gets us to ask this question: what part of Lafayette's tour is closest to Muscle Shoals? Montgomery. In Montgomery, he spent 2 days, including 1 day in a real bed. And you can actually come in on several pieces of modern roadway that follow his pathway to the letter. One part of it's even labeled Line Creek Road, which was the road to Montgomery. From Line Creek, which is the border of Montgomery and Macon counties, and it goes all the way up to Montgomery following Airport Boulevard, if you know that. It goes into town. There's even a tiny diagonal piece of it left right there. And he comes to spend his 2 days here, and you can make a little walking tour out of this. Let's start here. He met the politicos. Come on, computer, stay. At this place where there's a marker by the Capitol. They meet up on Goat Hill, which is this place where the Capitol is now. It was called Goat Hill because they put goats up there. There was no Capitol. Then he stayed at John Edmondson's house, and he parties the next day at Freeney's Tavern, spends an hour with the mayor equivalent over here, took a while to find that house, and ends up on a riverboat. That was it in 2 days. So here is Lucas's Tavern, fixed up, moved. Here's where Freeney's Taverns used to be, all the way back to 1899. It was in existence and photographed. Then it came down, and they rebuilt the tavern as a ghost structure. Now, just like then, it's a music venue, and you can eat there. And that's where Lafayette had his Montgomery Ball. Took a boat to Selma. They went at a whopping speed of 13 miles an hour. Whoa. And the site of it is right here along the river. It's still visible where the steamboats docked. This is the only place that ever in Selma that steamboats docked. So you can actually go there. This is off the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Looking here, there's a couple of historical markers talking about Lafayette and the Civil War. And it's right behind the St. James Hotel, which has reopened. It's the oldest hotel of its kind east of the Mississippi River. Goes way back to 1850. And when it reopened, it's really nice. If you have to go to Selma, that's a place to stay. They didn't pay me for that. Anyway, they end up in Cahaba, or then spelled with a W, and he stays only within 2 blocks between the Capitol and North 2nd Street, which is where one of 2 ramps to get off the junction point of the Cahaba River and the Alabama River. That's how you get into the city. He comes up in here, meets people. He needs help he's like me, he's got bad legs. He needs help getting up the river. So he had 2 big people, including the governor, help him up the street. It's an incline. They have all sorts of speeches under an arch, walk 2 blocks to where the Capitol used to be. The first capital of Georgia, we don't have any idea what it looks like. There are people's descriptions that some people have drawn, but there is no extant picture or photograph of the original Capitol, which was when the Capitol moved up to the north part of the state. They tore it down. There's a couple of pieces left in Lounsborough and in Selma that have been incorporated into other buildings. That's it. So, goes down here, has another speeches with the local people. Cahaba is often called a ghost capital or a ghost city, and it's more like a skeleton, a very emaciated skeleton, because all the buildings have collapsed and make holes in the ground, like they were just picked up, and the bones are the streets, because the streets still exist. If you go there, they actually have the 4 corners marked for most of the intersections. Even in the woods, you're walking in the woods and suddenly there's a post. Corner of this. No traffic. All right, so they built a ghost structure here. Nobody knows how accurate this is, but somebody paid money for it, or your taxes did. Then they go after several parties, one of which we cannot locate. There's a big ball there. We don't know where it happened. Nobody recorded where Lafayette's dinner was. We think it might have been the Capitol, but he was last seen at the Masons, which had a building just as big. So it's like, well, where was it? We don't know. So he goes down and makes an unexpected stop at Claiborne. Claiborne is a ghost town. There's nothing left of Claiborne. In a few places you can see trees that must have been on the sidewalks. That's it. So he grudgingly goes there, and he has to go 2 miles downriver to get off the boat, because Claiborne is built on a huge cliff, which used to have stairs on it for bringing up or putting down cotton bales. And it was a vertical stair. Piece of it's still there. No way I'm going to try it. So he goes to a ferry site, which still exists, and a woods road that you can follow along the river for 2 miles to get to where Claiborne and the Masons used to be. This has now been gated up. You can't go in. When I was there, it was open. So walk along that road. You could walk along the road Lafayette came on, if you can get permission. And then it heads off past the church. This is the pathway. It goes into the trees along the river, and it disappears until you get to the site of the Masons. Well, it's no longer there, and this is not it. This is a piece of the Dellett house that Lafayette's dinner took place. This is not original. The original burned down around 10 years after Lafayette was there. But behind it is the kitchen that cooked his dinner. Now, whether he went in there to say hi to the cooks, we don't know, but this is original from that time, from that visit. So there's a big stone kitchen from the 1820s. The Mason Hall that he went to was moved late in the 1800s to Purdue Hill, and it still exists. in good shape, still being used by the Masons and used as an event center. And the inside, a lot of the stuff in here is original from Lafayette's time. It's just not in the original place. Then he goes down to Mobile. By this point, Lafayette is exhausted. He does not want to do anything but sleep. So when he gets there, they had 3 days of celebration. This was the largest city in Alabama. Let's party. It's the city that the Mardi Gras was originally in, not New Orleans. Great, wonderful. He said, nope. You get the afternoon, and then we're leaving. He was behind schedule. He had to be in Boston to help put the cornerstone in for the Bunker Hill Monument, and he was already behind schedule. He wanted to go. Next stop, New Orleans. Well, you can trace the route that he took, but there's not one thing in Mobile that's original. Nothing exists from that time. He has to come up on Government Street, ends up in this sort of square. That is a wall that protects the entranceway to the tunnel under the river, under the Mobile River. And this is where he met the population. They go into what used to be the Spanish commandant's house at this site. I'd love to do archaeology there. Went to a place called Des Moines Tavern. That's one of the few places I could locate the site easily, and it's now a parking lot. And then he decides, as usual, he likes to visit the Masons. Nobody knew where it was. The local Masons didn't know. It's not on any map. But I found a reference here, and a reference there, and a reference here. It's like doing Venn diagram circles. This one says this says this, and where they overlap, that's where it was. It's right, not at the corner here. This is Bienville Square, the big city park, but it's about 50 feet up. That's where the Masons were. And then, as I said, Lafayette wanted to go visit his colleague that he'd never met. So they went to Mobile Point. And surprisingly, there is stuff there from Lafayette's time. There are two things for sure. One, Engineers Wharf. It was the only wharf they had to get to the fort, where they were rebuilding the fort. And structures from that wharf still exist in the water. And then the citadel and the bastions, the big walls on the outside, were just being built. We don't know which part he saw, but one of those parts were in existence when he got there. And the citadel is gone, but you can still see its imprint in the grass. At this point, Lafayette says, let's get going. Want to get to New Orleans. They pulled into the Gulf to figure out, where do we want to go? That was a big mistake, almost. Because as they were starting to head to New Orleans, they chose a certain route. A storm came up, which I think might have been an early precursor of a tropical system. And the boat nearly sank out of sight of the shore. It could have happened that Lafayette would have been here, and then in New Orleans he would never have shown up. It was that close. From there, from Fort Morgan, he heads to New Orleans, goes up the river, gets as far as St. Louis, comes back down, goes along the Ohio River until somewhere near Wheeling or Pittsburgh, gets back on land, heads up to Buffalo, follows but doesn't use the Erie Canal because it wasn't finished, and ends up making it to Bunker Hill with 2 days to spare. Now, because some of you have some interest in the Natchez Trace, I did a little quick research. I don't say that this was 100% accurate, but in Mississippi, the only place he stopped was Natchez on April 18th. And then later on, he goes to Nashville on a detour to go visit the city and future President Andrew Jackson. So for May 4th and 5th, and leaves on the 6th, he's in Nashville. Those are the two ends of the Natchez Trace. And I was curious to find out, did Lafayette see the trace? And the answer is no. He comes on the river somewhere down here, a place called Bacon's Landing that I couldn't find. And the area of under the hill was the site of his, the hotel he stayed at for the day. He gives a speech on the bluff. He stays in some place up here, has dinner, and the Natchez Trace is somewhere off to the right by a few miles. So he doesn't see it, though he's kind of connected to it by that long road. When he gets to Nashville, which is a whole lot bigger now, was a lot harder to find, and they changed the street names. It took me a whole day to try and translate all the streets from then to now. But he ends up in this area of Natchez. He does a lot of walking back and forth. He goes on a day trip to see Andrew Jackson up the river, comes back, and then he goes out on the 6th back to the main river. He's 17 miles away from the Natchez Trace. That's as close as he got. So he didn't actually see any of it. And it certainly wasn't in the middle. A warning right after Nashville, about 4 days later, they're on the Ohio River going down, and the boat capsizes. Almost loses his son, freaking out over that. All the belongings that they had went to the bottom of the river. They did pull the boat out, but it was unusable. So what do? Well, you can't catch the next bus. Well, you can catch the next steamboat. They commandeered the next steamboat. Whatever one it was, they got it. Okay. Now, he stays here until his birthday, where he has, at the halls of Congress, they have a dinner, and he gives a speech and all that. And the next day, he leaves Washington, D.C. to go back to France, and he never comes back. And he tries to make a revolution there several times to try and get him to get France to be more like the United States. And he doesn't succeed. They still have kings until the 1870s and emperors. So he's buried in Picpus. Remember me telling you about that? Well, that's where he is. And when he left the United States, he brought back crates of American soil. So he is buried in American soil, not French soil. And that is why there are American flags here, not because we're just honoring him. This is actually considered American soil, territory. Even during World War II, because of that implication, the Nazis would not go in that cemetery, because that would be an act of war. So what I'd like to see, one, I'd like to see a whole lot more preservation. The only things left from Lafayette's time that are original, mostly the route can be traced. And you can find fragments of the Federal Road in numerous places. That we can mark. We can mark that up. We can even do walking tours in 5 different places. What we can't, oops, I got some Georgia stuff in here, sorry about that. But of original sites, there's only 2. And some auxiliary parts from his time, like Crowell's house still exists, but most of the fort stuff does not. You can find that kitchen in Claiborne. Lafayette may have walked in there, we don't know. There is stuff at Fort Morgan. That's original. He saw that. But most of the original structures are gone. Second thing I'd like to do, one thing Lafayette didn't do very well, he wanted to see other sites, but he was in such a rush he hardly ever got to explore much. He got to meet the Indians. He got to meet other French survivors, Revolutionary War people. What we should do is try and honor the same stuff that he did and explore our state. Also the fact we should relish those cultural origins, including the Native Americans. The French and Spanish were here. Montgomery, if you don't know that, was once part of a small French city that didn't last long. We should honor the soldiers that are buried here, because many of his colleagues and his compatriots eventually moved down here, and this is where they died. So their burial sites should be cleaned up, marked, and on the day of the celebration, so when he's here next year in 2025, we should honor them as well and put their stories out, where they fought and so on. And honor his egalitarian views. He had no issues with, he had an issue with slavery. He wanted it abolished, but he was too polite to say much down here. But up north, he said it a lot. He didn't believe in slavery. He also really felt badly for the Creek Indians because he knew that their days were numbered. And he was right. 10 years later, the Trail of Tears. So, which brings me back to where I started. I wrote my book in part because I did not want people, when the 250th anniversary of his time here came along, I didn't want people to find that old green musty book with all the errors in it. And relying on Levasseur isn't perfect. So my books are meant for people to have in their libraries an accurate listing of every place he went. Because I'm not going to be here to give the speech in another 50 years. Not going to happen. So I have a promotion of Lafayette for Libraries, where if somebody buys a 9 days traveling for themselves, they can buy another copy at a discount to be donated free of library expense for that library to have to be put in their library stacks for people, for students today to do research, for planners to do research, and to be available for 250 years. So if you're interested as a group or an individual, you can buy a copy for yourself, get a second one, and I will send it to them, and you get a tax write-off, and you get a form to say that. And that takes us to the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you take part in many of the Lafayette celebrations that are beginning to rev up for next year. There will be impersonators of Lafayette acting out his part at the different places that he went to, but that doesn't mean you can't celebrate it here. Because before 1824, during the Revolutionary War, we were Georgians. There was Revolutionary War there. We're entitled to celebrate it. So I hope you do. Thank you very much for paying attention to me. I hope you've got something out of it, and I would be delighted to answer any possible questions. Thank you.